Joseph Haydn, the 31st of March 1732 to 31 May 1809, was a prolific Austrian composer of the classical period. He was instrumental in the development of chamber music such as the piano trio, and his contributions to musical form have earned him the epithets "Father of the Symphony" and "Father of the String Quartet." Haydn spent much of his career as a court musician for the wealthy Esterházy family at the remote estate. Until the later part of his life, this isolated him from other composers and trends in music, so that he was, as he put it, forced to become original. Yet his music circulated widely, and for much of his career he was the most celebrated composer in Europe. Joseph Haydn, a friend and mentor of Mozart and teacher of Beethoven, was the older brother of composer Michael Haydn. Biography. Early life. Joseph Haydn was born in Rohrau, Austria, a village that at the time stood on the border with Hungary. His father was Matthias Haydn, a wheelwright who also served as Marktrichter and office akin to village mayor. Haydn's mother, Maria, an acute collar, had previously worked as a cook in the palace of Count Harry, the presiding aristocrat of Rohrau. Neither parent could read music. However, Matthias was an enthusiastic folk musician, who during the journeyman period of his career had taught himself to play the harp. According to Haydn's later reminiscences, his childhood family was extremely musical, and frequently sang together and with the neighbors. Haydn's parents had noticed that the son was musically gifted and knew that in Rohrau he would have no chance to obtain serious musical training. It was for this reason that, around the time Haydn turned 6, they accepted a proposal from the relative Johann Matthias Frank, the schoolmaster and choirmaster in Hainburg, that Haydn be apprenticed to Frank in his home to train as a musician. Haydn therefore went off with Frank to Hainburg, 12 kilometers away. He never again lived with his parents. Life in the Frank household was not easy for Haydn, who later remembered being frequently hungry and humiliated by the filthy state of his clothing. He began his musical training there, and could soon play both harpsichord and violin. The people of Hainburg heard him sing treble parts in the church choir. There is reason to think that Haydn's singing impressed those who heard him, because in 1739 he was brought to the attention of Georg von Ritter, the director of music in St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, who happened to be visiting Hainburg and was looking for new choir boys. Haydn passed his audition with Ritter, and after several months of further training moved to Vienna, where he worked for the next 9 years as a chorister. Haydn lived in the Kapellhaus next to the cathedral, along with Ritter's family, and the other 4 choir boys, which after 1745 included his younger brother Michael. The choir boys were instructed in Latin and other school subjects, as well as voice, violin, and keyboard. Ritter was of little help to Haydn in the areas of music theory and composition, giving him only 2 lessons in his entire time as chorister. However, since St. Stephen's was one of the leading musical centers in Europe, Haydn learned a great deal simply by serving as a professional musician there. Like Frank before him, Ritter did not always bother to make sure Haydn was properly fed. As he later told his biographer Albert Christoph Dies, Haydn was motivated to sing well, in hopes of gaining more invitations to perform before aristocratic audiences, where the singers were usually served refreshments. Struggles as a freelancer. By 1749, Haydn had matured physically to the point that he was no longer able to sing high choral parts. Empress Maria Theresa herself complained to Ritter about his singing, calling it crowing. One day Haydn carried out a prank, snipping off the pigtail of a fellow chorister. This was enough for Ritter. Haydn was first caned, then summarily dismissed and sent into the streets. He had the good fortune to be taken in by a friend, Johann Michael Spangler, who shared his family's crowded garret room with Haydn for a few months. Haydn immediately began his pursuit of a career as a freelance musician. Haydn struggled at first, working at many different jobs, as a music teacher, as a street serenader, and eventually, in 1752, as valet accompanist for the Italian composer Nicola Porpora, from whom he later said he learned the true fundamentals of composition. He was also briefly in Count Friedrich Wilhelm von Horvitz's employ, playing the organ in the Bohemian Chancellery Chapel at the Judenplatz. While a chorister, Haydn had not received any systematic training in music theory and composition. As a remedy, he worked his way through the counterpoint exercises in the text Gradus ad Parnassum by Johann Joseph Fuchs and carefully studied the work of Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, whom he later acknowledged as an important influence. As his skills increased, Haydn began to acquire a public reputation. First is the composer of an opera, Der krumme Teufel, The Limping Devil, written for the comic actor Johann Joseph Felix Kurz, whose stage name was Bernardin. The work was premiered successfully in 1753, but was soon closed down by the censors due to offensive remarks. Haydn also noticed, apparently without annoyance, that works he had simply given away were being published and sold in local music shops. Between 1754 and 1756, Haydn also worked freelance for the court in Vienna. He was among several musicians who were paid for services as supplementary musicians at balls given for the imperial children during carnival season, and as supplementary singers in the imperial chapel in Lent and Holy Week. With the increase in his reputation, Haydn eventually obtained aristocratic patronage, crucial for the career of a composer in his day. Countess Thun, having seen one of Haydn's compositions, summoned him and engaged him as her singing and keyboard teacher. In 1756, Baron Karl Joseph Fernberg employed Haydn at his country estate, Weinzierl, where the composer wrote his first string quartets. Fernberg later recommended Haydn to Count Morzin, who, in 1757, became his first full-time employer. The years as Kapellmeister. Haydn's job title under Count Morzin was Kapellmeister, that is, music director. He led the Count's small orchestra and wrote his first symphonies for this ensemble. In 1760, with the security of a Kapellmeister position, Haydn married. His wife was the former Maria Anna Theresia Keller, the sister of Therese, with whom Haydn had previously been in love. Haydn and his wife had a completely unhappy marriage, from which the laws of the time permitted them no escape. They produced no children. Both took lovers. Count Morzin soon suffered financial reverses that forced him to dismiss his musical establishment. But Haydn was quickly offered a similar job by Prince Paul Anton, head of the immensely wealthy Esterházy family. Haydn's job title was only Vice-Kapellmeister, but he was immediately placed in charge of most of the Esterházy musical establishment, with the old Kapellmeister, Gregor Werner, retaining authority only for church music. When Werner died in 1766, Haydn was elevated to full Kapellmeister. As a house officer in the Esterházy establishment, Haydn wore livery and followed the family as they moved among the various palaces. Most importantly, the family's ancestral seat Schloss Esterházy in Eisenstadt and later on Esterházy, a grand new palace built in rural Hungary in the 1760s. Haydn had a huge range of responsibilities, including composition, running the orchestra, playing chamber music for and with his patrons, and eventually the mounting of operatic productions. Despite this backbreaking workload, the job was in artistic terms a superb opportunity for Haydn. The Esterházy princes were musical connoisseurs who appreciated his work and gave him daily access to his own small orchestra. During the nearly 30 years that Haydn worked at the Esterházy court, he produced a flood of compositions. and his musical style continued to develop. Much of Haydn's activity at the time followed the specific musical interest of his patron Prince Nicholas. Thus, in about 1765 the prince obtained and began to learn to play the baritone, an uncommon musical instrument similar to the bass viol but with a set of plucked sympathetic strings. Haydn was commanded to provide music for the prince to play, and over the next 10 years produced about 200 works for this instrument in various ensembles, of which the most notable are the 126 baritone trios. Around 1775 the prince abandoned the baritone and took up a new hobby, opera productions. Previously a sporadic event for special occasions, became the focus of musical life at court, and the opera theatre the prince had built at Esterházy came to host a major season with multiple productions each year. Haydn served as director of the company, recruiting and training the singers and preparing and leading the performances. He also wrote several of the operas performed and wrote substitution arias to insert into the operas of other composers. 1779 was a watershed year for Haydn, as his contract was renegotiated. Whereas previously all his compositions were the property of the Esterházy family, he now was permitted to write for others and sell his work to publishers. Haydn soon shifted his emphasis in composition to reflect this, and he negotiated with multiple publishers, both Austrian and foreign. Of Haydn's new employment contract, Jones writes, "This single document acted as a catalyst in the next stage in Haydn's career, the achievement of international popularity." By 1790 Haydn was in the paradoxical, if not bizarre, position of being Europe's leading composer, but someone who spent his time as a duty-bound Kapellmeister in a remote palace in the Hungarian countryside. The new publication campaign resulted in the composition of a great number of new string quartets. Haydn also composed in response to commissions from abroad, the Paris symphonies and the original orchestral version of the Seven Last Words of Christ, a commission from Cadiz, Spain. The remoteness of Esterházy, which was farther from Vienna than Eisenstadt, led Haydn gradually to feel more isolated and lonely. He longed to visit Vienna because of his friendships there. Of these, a particularly important one was with Maria Anna von Genzinger, the wife of Prince Nikolaus's personal physician in Vienna, who began a close, platonic relationship with the composer in 1789. Haydn wrote to Mrs. Genzinger often, expressing his loneliness at Esterházy and his happiness for the few occasions on which he was able to visit her in Vienna. Later on, Haydn wrote to her frequently from London. Her premature death in 1793 was a blow to Haydn, and his F minor variations for piano, Op. 17.6, may have been written in response to her death. Another friend in Vienna was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, whom Haydn had met sometime around 1784. According to later testimony by Michael Kelly and others, the two composers occasionally played in string quartets together. Haydn was hugely impressed with Mozart's work and praised it unstintingly to others. Mozart evidently returned the esteem, as seen in his dedication of a set of 6 quartets, now called the Haydn Quartets, to his friend. For further details see Haydn and Mozart. The London journeys in 1790. Prince Nicholas died and was succeeded as prince by his son Anton. Following a trend of the time, Anton sought to economize by dismissing most of the court musicians. Haydn retained a nominal appointment with Anton, at a reduced salary of 400 florins, as well as a 1,000 florin pension from Nikolaus. Since Anton had little need of Haydn's services, he was was willing to let him travel, and the composer accepted a lucrative offer from Johann Peter Salomon, a German violinist and impresario, to visit England and conduct new symphonies with a large orchestra. The choice was a sensible one because Haydn was already a very popular composer there. Since the death of Johann Christian Bach in 1782, Haydn's music had dominated the concert scene in London. Hardly a concert did not feature a work by him. Haydn's work was widely distributed by publishers in London, including Forster and Longman and Amp Brodrill. Efforts to bring Haydn to London had been undertaken since 1782, though Haydn's loyalty to Prince Nicholas had prevented him from accepting. After fond farewells from Mozart and other friends, Haydn departed Vienna with Salomon on 15 December 1790, arriving in Calais in time to cross the English Channel on New Year's Day of 1791. It was the first time that a 58-year-old composer had seen the ocean. Arriving in London, Haydn stayed with Salomon in Great Pulteney Street, working in a borrowed studio at the Broadwood piano firm nearby. It was the start of a very auspicious period for Haydn. Both the 1791 to 1792 journey, along with a repeat visit in 1794 to 1795, were greatly successful. Audiences flocked to Haydn's concerts. He augmented his fame and made large profits, thus becoming financially secure. Charles Burney reviewed the first concert thus: Haydn himself presided at the pianoforte, and the sight of that renowned composer so electrified the audience, as to excite an attention and a pleasure superior to any that had ever been caused by instrumental music in England. Haydn made many new friends and, for a time, was involved in a romantic relationship with Rebecca Schroeter. Musically, Haydn's visits to England generated some of his best-known work, including the surprise military drumroll in London symphonies, the Rider Quartet, and the Gypsy Rondo piano trio. The great success of the overall enterprise does not mean that their journeys were free of trouble. Notably, his very first project, the commissioned opera L'Anima del Filosofo, was duly written during the early stages of the trip, but the opera's impresario John Gallini was unable to obtain a license to permit opera performances in the theatre he directed, the King's Theatre. Haydn was well paid for the opera, but much time was wasted. Thus only two new symphonies, No. 95 and No. 96, Miracle, could be premiered in the 12 concerts of Salomon's Spring Concert Series. Another problem arose from the jealously competitive efforts of a senior, rival orchestra, the Professional Concerts, who recruited Haydn's old pupil Ignaz Plal as a rival visiting composer, the two composers, refusing to play along with the concocted rivalry, dined together and put each other's symphonies on their concert programs. The end of Salomon's series in June gave Haydn a rare period of relative leisure. He spent some of the time in the country, but also had time to travel, notably to Oxford, where he was awarded an honorary doctorate by the university. The symphony performed for the occasion, No. 92, has since come to be known as the Oxford Symphony, although it had been written in 1789. While traveling to London in 1790, Haydn had met the young Ludwig van Beethoven in his native city of Bonn. On Haydn's return, Beethoven came to Vienna, and during the time up to the second London visit was Haydn's pupil. Haydn took Beethoven with him to Eisenstadt for the summer and also taught Beethoven some counterpoint. For discussion of the relationship, see Beethoven and his contemporaries. While in Vienna, Haydn purchased a house for himself and his wife life in the suburbs and started remodeling it. He also arranged for the performance of some of his London symphonies in local concerts. By the time he arrived on his second journey to England, Haydn had become a familiar figure on the London concert scene. The 1794 season was dominated by Salomon's ensemble, as the professional concerts had abandoned their efforts. The concerts included the premieres of the 99th, 100th, and 101st symphonies. For 1795, Salomon had abandoned his own series, citing difficulty in obtaining vocal performers of the first rank from abroad, and Haydn joined forces with the opera concerts, headed by the violinist Giovanni Battista Viotti. These were the venue of the last three symphonies, 102, 103, and 104. The final benefit concert for Haydn at the end of the 1795 season was a great success and was perhaps the peak of his English career. Haydn's biographer Griesinger wrote that Haydn considered the days spent in England the happiest of his life. He was everywhere appreciated there. It opened a new world to him. Years of celebrity in Vienna. Haydn returned to Vienna in 1795. Prince Anton had died, and his successor Nikolaus II proposed that the Esterházy musical establishment be revived, with Haydn serving again as Kapellmeister. Haydn took up the position on a part-time basis. He spent his summers with the Esterházys in Eisenstadt, and over the course of several years wrote 6 masses for them. By this time Haydn had become a public figure in Vienna. He spent most of his time in his home, a large house in the suburb of Windmühle, and wrote works for public performance, in collaboration with his librettist and mentor Gottfried van Swieten, and with funding from van Swieten's Gesellschaft der Associaten. He composed his 2 great oratorios, The Creation and The Seasons. Both were enthusiastically received. Haydn frequently appeared before the public, often leading performances of The Creation and The Seasons for charity benefits, including Tonkünstler Society programs with massed musical forces. He also composed instrumental music, the popular trumpet concerto, and the last 9 in his long series of string quartets, including the Fifths, Emperor and Sunrise. A brief work, Gott erhalte Franz den Kaiser, achieved great success and became the enduring emblem of Austrian identity right up to the First World War. In modern times it became the national anthem of Germany. During the later years of this successful period, Haydn faced incipient old age and fluctuating health, and he had to struggle to complete his final works. His last major work, from 1802, was the 6th Mass for the Esterházys, the Harmonium Messi. Retirement, illness, and death. By the end of 1803, Haydn's condition had declined to the point that he became physically unable to compose. He suffered from weakness, dizziness, inability to concentrate, and painfully swollen legs. Since diagnosis was uncertain in Haydn's time, it is unlikely that the precise illness can ever be identified, though Jones suggests arteriosclerosis. The illness was especially hard for Haydn because the flow of fresh musical ideas waiting to be worked out as compositions continued unabated. His biographer Dies reported a conversation from 1806, "I must have something to do. Usually musical ideas are pursuing me, to the point of torture. I cannot escape them. They stand like walls before me. If it's an allegro that pursues me, my pulse keeps beating faster, I can get no sleep. If it's an adagio, then I notice my pulse beating slowly. My imagination plays on me as if I were a clavier. Haydn smiled, the blood rushed to his face, and he said, "I am really just a living clavier." The winding down of Haydn's career was gradual. The Esterházy family kept him on as Kapellmeister to the very end, but they appointed new staff to lead the musical establishment. Johann Michael Fuchs in 1802 as Vice-Kapellmeister and Johann Nepomuk Hummel as Concertmeister in 1804. Haydn's last summer in Eisenstadt was in 1803, and his last appearance before the public as a conductor was a charity performance of the Seven Last Words on the 26th of December 1803. As debility set in, he made largely futile efforts at composition, attempting to revise a rediscovered Missive Brevis from his teenage years and complete his final string quartet. The latter project was abandoned for good in 1805, and the quartet was published with just 2 movements. Haydn was well cared for by his servants, and he received many visitors and public honors during his last years, but they could not have been very happy years for him. During his illness, Haydn often found solace by sitting at the piano and playing his Emperor's Hymn. A final triumph occurred on the 27th of March 1808 when a performance of the Creation was organized in his honor. The very frail composer was brought into the hall on an armchair to the sound of trumpets and drums and was greeted by Beethoven, Salieri and by other musicians and members of the aristocracy. Haydn was both moved and exhausted by the experience and had to depart at intermission. Haydn lived on for 14 more months. His final days were hardly serene, as in May 1809 the French army under Napoleon launched an attack on Vienna and on the 10th of May bombarded his neighborhood. According to Griesing, 4 case shots fell, rattling the windows and doors of his house. He called out in a loud voice to his alarmed and frightened people, "Don't be afraid, children, where Haydn is, no harm can reach you." But the spirit was stronger than the flesh, for he had hardly uttered the brave words when his whole body began to tremble. More bombardments followed until the city fell to the French on the 13th of May. Haydn was, however, deeply moved and appreciative when on the 17th of May a French cavalry officer named Sulémy came to pay his respects and sang, skillfully, an aria from the Creation. On the 26th of May Haydn played his Emperor's Hymn with unusual gusto 3 times. The same evening he collapsed and was taken to what proved to be his deathbed. He died peacefully at 12:40 a.m. on the 31st of May 1809, aged 77. On the 15th of June, a memorial service was held in the Schottenkirche at which Mozart's Requiem was performed. Haydn's remains were interred in the local Hundsturm cemetery until 1820, when they were moved to Eisenstadt by Prince Nicholas. His head took a different journey. It was stolen shortly after burial by phrenologists, and the skull was reunited with the other remains only in 1954. For details see Haydn's head.